The lights are going out across Europe, and the woman who holds the switch has just boarded a plane. Not to a crisis summit, not to an emergency session in Brussels, to escape. Ursula von der Leyen, the most powerful unelected bureaucrat on the planet, has vanished at the exact moment the continent she controls is being humiliated, bankrupted, and abandoned by its last remaining ally. Marco Rubio has just slammed the door in Europe's face. The trade deals are dead. The oil is gone, and the president of the European Commission is nowhere to be found. This is not a political story. This is the story of how 500 million people were left holding the bill while their leaders ran for the exits. For weeks, the European Commission has been selling the public a carefully packaged lie. The message from Brussels was always the same: steady hands, strong leadership, Europe united. But the mask has finally slipped, and what is underneath it is not strength. It is panic, incompetence, and the desperate scrambling of an elite class that gambled with an entire continent's future and lost every single bet. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers do not lie, even when the politicians do. Brent crude is sitting at $110 a barrel. European gas storage has collapsed to a terrifying 30%, a level that energy analysts are calling functionally catastrophic for the coming winter. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil supply, has been choked shut for over 5 consecutive weeks. And at petrol stations across Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, ordinary working people are standing at pumps watching the digits climb past 3 per liter, doing the mathematics in their heads and coming up short every single time. This is not a projection. This is not a warning. This is happening right now, today, on the ground in real time. And the people responsible for preventing it are either invisible or incompetent. And in most cases, they are both. Ursula von der Leyen did not stumble into this crisis. She walked Europe directly into it, one disastrous policy decision at a time, and then had the extraordinary audacity to disappear when the consequences arrived. Cast your mind back to 2011. As a minister in the German cabinet, she voted with both hands to shut down Germany's nuclear power infrastructure, stripping the continent's largest economy of its most stable and independent source of energy. It was a political gesture dressed up as environmental conscience, and it left Germany exposed, dependent, and vulnerable. Then came 2022, when she led the charge to sever Europe's energy relationship with Russia overnight, cutting the gas pipeline without a single credible replacement in sight, without a safety net, without a plan B. She stood at microphones across the continent and called it courage. She called it solidarity. What it actually was an economic grenade thrown into the engine room of the European economy, and the shrapnel is still tearing through household budgets to this day. Now, in the spring of 2026, the Qatar tap has run dry. The Middle East is in open conflict. The shipping lanes are paralyzed, and Europe is staring into an energy abyss that Ursula von der Leyen built brick by brick, speech by speech, over 15 years of ideological policymaking that treated real-world consequences as someone else's problem. So where is she? Where is the president of the European Commission during the darkest energy month in the history of the Union? She is in Australia. She is shaking hands on camera. She is smiling for cameras against the backdrop of eucalyptus trees and diplomatic receptions, thousands of miles away from the crisis center, thousands of miles away from the empty storage tanks, thousands of miles away from the families who cannot afford to heat their homes. Journalists tracking her official movements found not an emergency agenda, not a crisis response schedule, but a curated tour of PR opportunities, photo ops, handshakes, carefully lit portraits of a woman performing leadership while refusing to do it. This is not negligence. Negligence is accidental. This is a calculated retreat. Ursula von der Leyen has read the room, and she knows that there are no good answers left. No clever phrases that can explain away 30% gas storage or $110 oil. No speech powerful enough to reverse 15 years of failed energy policy in a single press conference. So she has chosen the only option available to someone with no solutions: distance. She is staying on mission, as her office calls it, while the mission at home is failing catastrophically. And the cost of her absence is not being billed to her office in Brussels. It is being deducted from your salary. It is buried in your heating invoice. It is sitting in the price of every loaf of bread, every tank of fuel, every grocery receipt that makes you pause and recalculate whether you can make it to the end of the month. The president of Europe has gone on a world tour, and you are the one paying for the ticket. But as damaging as Ursula's vanishing act is, it is only half the story. Because while she was perfecting the art of strategic absence, The woman left behind to speak for Europe, the woman supposedly representing 500 million citizens on the world stage, just walked into the most humiliating diplomatic catastrophe in the modern history of the European Union. And unlike Ursula, she did not have the luxury of running away. She had to stand there and take it in a room full of the world's most powerful people while the United States of America dismantled her in front of everyone. What happened next in that G7 chamber did not just embarrass one politician. It exposed the rotting foundation of everything Brussels has been telling you about European strength, European unity, and European relevance. And once you see it clearly, you will never look at these leaders the same way again. Kaja Kallas walked into that G7 ministerial meeting in late March believing she was carrying the moral authority of an entire continent on her shoulders. She had spent months cultivating the image of Europe's iron voice, the hawk from the Baltic, the woman who grew up under Soviet occupation and therefore understood better than anyone what was at stake in the global confrontation with authoritarian power. She arrived in that chamber with her talking points polished, her posture straight, and her conviction intact. She left it as something else entirely, a warning to every European citizen about exactly how much weight their leaders actually carry when they step outside the comfortable echo chamber of Brussels and into the real world. The scene that unfolded was not a diplomatic disagreement. It was not a tense exchange of competing viewpoints between equal partners. What happened in that room was a public execution, and the executioner did not even bother to lower his voice. Marco Rubio, the United States Secretary of State, sat across from Kallas and listened as she attempted to play the role she had been rehearsing for months. She turned to him directly and demanded to know when Washington would finally lose patience with Moscow. The phrasing was deliberate, the tone was commanding, and the expectation was clear. She wanted a nod. She wanted reassurance. She wanted the Americans to fall back into the familiar posture of the last 7 decades, where Washington quietly validated whatever Brussels decided and picked up the tab for whatever Brussels could not afford. Instead, Rubio erupted. 3 separate sources confirmed to Axios that he raised his voice, leaning into the microphone with the full force of someone who had heard enough. His words were not diplomatic. They were not carefully worded for later denial. He said, "In a room full of the world's most senior diplomats, we are doing everything we can. If you think you can handle this better, please be our guest. We will step aside." Read those words carefully. The Secretary of State of the United States of America looked at the European Union's top diplomat and told her to handle it herself. He did not offer compromise. He did not soften the blow with the usual language of allied solidarity. He drew a line in the room and dared her to cross it, knowing full well she had nothing behind her to back up the bluster. The silence that followed was described by everyone present as physically uncomfortable. European ministers, seasoned diplomats who have spent careers navigating the most delicate rooms on the planet, had to physically move from their seats to stand between Kallas and Rubio, not to continue the conversation, but to stop it from collapsing entirely. She was not seen as a peer. She was not seen as a challenge. She was seen as a disruption, a noise in the room that needed to be managed and moved past so that the adults could continue. The lioness of Estonia had become the nuisance of the G7, and every person in that chamber saw it happen in real time. But that humiliation did not begin in the meeting room. It began weeks earlier when Kallas made the decision to travel to Washington for direct talks with the State Department, a trip her office presented to the European press as a major diplomatic offensive. The reality was considerably less impressive. Rubio refused to meet her, not rescheduled, not delayed due to prior commitments, refused. Kallas was left standing at the door of the State Department like a junior lobbyist who had sent an email to the wrong address. No meeting, no phone call, no courtesy acknowledgement from the most powerful diplomatic office on earth. For the woman supposedly speaking for 500 million people, it was a humiliation so complete that her own staff struggled to find language to explain it to journalists without making it worse than it already was. This is the reality hiding behind the phrase European strategic autonomy, a term that Brussels has been inserting into every official document, every commission report, and every primetime press conference for the past 4 years. Strategic autonomy. It sounds formidable. It sounds like a declaration of independent power, a continent capable of charting its own course without leaning on Washington as a crutch. But strip away the language and look at what it actually means in practice. And what you find is this: a top diplomat who cannot get a meeting in Washington, getting publicly dressed down in a multilateral chamber, representing a continent that cannot keep its own lights on without permission from the countries it lectures about human rights and democratic values. That is not autonomy. That is a performance of autonomy staged for a domestic audience that is rapidly running out of patience for the theater. And then came the moment that should follow Kalas for the remainder of her political career. The phrase that captures, with perfect devastating clarity, exactly what European leadership has become in this crisis. When journalists cornered her after the G7 disaster and pressed her on the Strait of Hormuz, on the 5 weeks of blocked shipping lanes, on the oil that was not flowing, and the gas that was not filling the storage tanks, and the winter that was coming. Regardless of how many diplomatic phrases she deployed, Callas looked into the cameras and said, "It is not our war. We did not start it." Pause on that. Let it settle. The High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the official whose singular purpose is to protect European interests on the global stage, looked at the single greatest threat to European energy security in living memory and said it was not her department. The jugular vein of the European economy is being squeezed shut, and the person holding the scalpel decided it was someone else's operating table. The selective courage of Kalas is what makes this truly unforgivable. On Ukraine, she is relentless. She pounds tables, demands billions in military aid, travels to Kiev for solidarity photographs, and declares with absolute conviction that time is on our side and that Europe will stand firm for as long as it takes. There is no hesitation, no nuance, no acknowledgement that the European public might have questions about the cost. The moral clarity is total and the hawkish energy is bottomless, but rotate the map 90 degrees. Move the crisis from Eastern Europe to the Persian Gulf. Watch what happens when the conflict is not the one she prepared her speeches for. Suddenly, the hawk disappears. Suddenly, there is no appetite for a European naval mission to reopen the shipping lanes. Suddenly, there is no table to pound and no declaration of solidarity to deliver. Suddenly, it is not our war. This is not a principled position. A principled position applies consistently, regardless of geography or political convenience. What Callas is practicing is something far more cynical. It is the diplomacy of selective engagement, where Europe shows up loudly for the crises that generate good headlines in Brussels and goes conspicuously quiet on the ones that require actual sacrifice, actual risk, and actual leadership. And the price of that silence is not being paid in the corridors of the Berlaymont building. It is being paid in the home heating bills of families in Warsaw, in the factory closure notices landing on desks in Munich, in the bankruptcy filings piling up in the industrial heartland of a continent whose leaders decided that optics mattered more than outcomes. And just when you thought the damage was contained to Callas alone, Donald Trump picked up the microphone. And what he said on April 1st did not just confirm Europe's worst fears, it ended an era entirely, with the casual indifference of a man who has clearly decided that Europe's opinion is no longer a factor worth calculating. Trump's message was 4 words that 70 years of European foreign policy were never built to survive. And the moment he said them out loud, every trade deal, every energy agreement, and every security guarantee Europe thought it had suddenly became a question mark instead of a promise. Donald Trump stood before the cameras on April 1st and delivered 4 sentences that should be playing on a loop in every parliament building across Europe. He did not whisper it. He did not soften it through diplomatic language or leave room for creative interpretation. He said verbatim, "The Strait of Hormuz is not our problem. Whoever needs oil from the Persian Gulf, go and get it yourself." That was it. No allied consultation, no emergency call to Brussels, no courtesy warning to the continent that has lived under the American security umbrella for 7 consecutive decades. Just a door slammed shut in front of 500 million people who never bothered to build one of their own. For 70 years, Europe constructed its entire foreign policy architecture on a single foundational assumption, that America would always show up, that Washington would always be willing to play the role of global janitor, cleaning up the messes, securing the shipping lanes, guaranteeing the oil flows, and absorbing the cost while Brussels focused on writing climate targets and human rights frameworks that it never had to physically defend. That assumption is now dead. Trump did not kill it. He simply had the honesty to say out loud what his predecessors quietly believed. Europe is on its own. Your oil, your gas, your problem, your headache. And the European Commission's response to this historic rupture was the most damning indictment of its leadership yet. Silence. Not a strategy, not an emergency summit, not a single coordinated statement from Ursula, Callas, and Costa speaking with one unified voice to reassure a continent sliding toward an energy catastrophe. Instead, what Europe got was 3 leaders pointing in 3 different directions simultaneously. Ursula declaring the death of the world order from a podium in Australia, Callas insisting the Middle East crisis is not Europe's war, Costa contradicting both of them by saying the rules must still be defended. 3 presidents, 3 messages, 0 plan. This is not leadership under pressure. This is the complete institutional disintegration of the European project happening in plain sight. And the people at the top are too busy managing their own legacies to notice the floor collapsing beneath them. Meanwhile, the leaders Europe spent years mocking are now the ones keeping the lights on. Giorgia Meloni did not wait for a Zoom call from Brussels. She boarded a plane to Riyadh and Doha and sat across from Gulf leaders, hand in hand negotiating the emergency gas supply agreements that Ursula's policies made necessary. Viktor Orban, frozen out, sanctioned and humiliated by the very commission now begging to copy his energy playbook, is watching Hungary's storage levels hold steady while Germany's industrial backbone quietly snaps. The people who were right are being punished. The people who were catastrophically wrong are still collecting their salaries, still flying business class to summits on the other side of the world, and still showing absolutely no sign that resignation is a concept they have considered even for a single moment. So, will Ursula von der Leyen resign? The honest answer is that she will not resign voluntarily, because people who have never faced real consequences do not develop a reflex for accountability. But the question is no longer whether she should go. The question is whether Europe can survive long enough for the politics to catch up with the catastrophe. The era of empty poses is finished. The era of consequences has arrived, and the final bill, every frozen pipe, every shuttered factory, every family choosing between groceries and heating is addressed to your kitchen table, not hers. If they are still hiding while your bills keep climbing, the least you can do is make sure everyone sees it. Share this video, drop a comment, and hit subscribe, because the next crash is already in motion and you need to be the first to know when it lands.